Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the autobiography. Chapter 1. 6. Simon made Virgin the hippest place to be. 1971, 1972. Before the postal strike nearly ruined us in January 1971, someone my age with a South African accent walked into my office at South Wharf Road and introduced himself as my cousin. Simon Draper had graduated from Natal University and come over to London with just £100 and the idea of staying for a while. He was thinking of doing a postgraduate degree, perhaps following his brother, who had been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, but in the meantime he was looking for a job. Simon had sat next to my mother at a family dinner party over Christmas, and she had told him to get in touch with me. After Simon had exhausted the hospitality of both sides of his family over Christmas and New Year, he moved into a flat in London and tracked down the Virgin Records shop in Oxford Street. Sandy O'Connell, the manager, told him to go over and see me at South Wharf Road. He arrived just before lunch. We went off to have something to eat at the Greek restaurant round the corner in Praed Street. There, over lukewarm meatballs, chips and peas, Simon explained what he wanted to do. While he had been at Natal University, he had also worked on the South African Sunday Times. He told me stories of sitting up through Saturday night until the first edition was ready, and then leaving work to go to a jazz club with the first edition tucked under his arm. We swapped stories about journalism, and then moved on to music. Simon was obsessed by music, because I had left school so young, and had never been to university. I had missed out on those long evenings spent lying around listening to music. Even though music was playing constantly in the student basement, I was too busy calling up advertisers and negotiating with printers to absorb it. If I heard a record, I knew whether I liked it or not, but I couldn't compare it with some other band or recognize that it had been influenced by the Velvet Underground. It seemed to me that Simon had listened to every record released by every band. He didn't just casually enjoy the latest Doors album. He thoroughly understood what they were doing, how they had developed from their previous album, and how this album compared with a whole catalog of music. He had hosted his own half-hour show on Natal Radio, and I soon realized that he knew more about music than anyone I'd ever met. We also talked about politics. Although I had been involved in various political demonstrations, such as the anti-Vietnam War March to Grosvenor Square, this was nothing compared with the brutality of South African politics. Simon was steeped in both music and politics, and saw music as one way to make a political protest. One of Simon's fellow students at Natal University had been Steve Biko, who was then leading the all-black South African Students' Organization. Simon's tutor, a Marxist, had been shot by government-backed vigilantes in front of his own children. The South African government then did not tolerate any form of political dissent. Simon was not allowed to play any song with political or sexual connotations, such as those by Jimi Hendrix or Bob Dylan. By the time we were on our coffee, I had persuaded Simon to come and work at Virgin, to be the record buyer for the Virgin Records shop and the Virgin mail order list. There was no awkward salary negotiation since everyone at Virgin was paid the same, £20 per week. Tony Mellor had moved from working on Student to compiling the mail order list. We were still trying to sell Student to another magazine company, and although it had not been published for over a year, Tony kept producing dummies of the next issue, with which we tried to impress potential buyers. He was therefore happy to hand the record buying to Simon and revert to the more political question of Student's future. Tony simply gave Simon the one golden unbreakable rule. Virgin doesn't ever stock Andy Williams, and handed over the first joint of the morning. You don't need to worry, Simon said. I'd be the last person to break that one. And from then on Simon was on his own. I rather left him to it for the first few months. I was falling in love with Kristen, and trying to prevent her going back to finish her architectural course in America. I offered her the job of further renovating the manor. Come on, I said. You don't have to study for 6 years to qualify as an architect. Just start doing it. After not too much persuading, she eventually agreed with me and set to work. She was a natural with perfect taste. With her long blonde hair and fine, almost elfin face, Kristen soon became a familiar figure at all the auction rooms around London, as she bid for large remarkable pieces of furniture for the manor. While Nick managed the costs of both the mail-order business and the Virgin Records shops, Simon began to define the mail-order list, as well as the Virgin Records shops themselves, by choosing which records to stock. Simon's taste in music quickly became the single most critical element of the Virgin ethos. A record shop is not just a record shop, it is an arbiter of taste. I had no idea what music to promote, but Simon was full of wonderful plans to bring in unknown foreign albums unavailable elsewhere. There was a thin dividing line between what was hip and what wasn't, and Simon made Virgin the hippest place to be. He started importing records directly from America, flying them in to beat the competition. We only ever dealt in albums because singles were mainly either crass or were lost leaders to promote albums. In the 1970s, serious bands such as Pink Floyd, Yes or Genesis rarely released singles. An album was seen as a combination of political statement, art, and a way of life. The serious bands didn't produce dance music. Theirs was music to savor while lying down. There was a good deal of discussion about different recordings of the same songs, something which became especially interesting when the American albums arrived with different covers from the British versions, sometimes even different versions of the songs. These days CDs have been standardized to be mass-marketed around the world, as well as imports, notably from Germany, France and America, and a furtive trade in live bootleg recordings. We also made a lot of money by dealing in deletions, recordings which had gone out of stock and were being sold off by the record company. Since we operated a mail-order business, we had hundreds of letters every day asking for special recordings. We thus knew which of these deletions actually had some residual demand, and it was quite simple for us to pick up the popular ones cheaply and sell them on. Most people assume that a record shop's success lies in selling records. In fact, Virgin's success both in mail order and the record shops lay in Simon's skill at buying records. He was able to pick out bands that did not sell through the mainstream shops and sell large numbers of them. Through Virgin, he knew so much about music that he knew which bands would sell even before they were a proven success. He was already using the antennae which enabled us to set up the record label 2 years later. Without Simon, such a move would have been a step in the dark. Our other genius was John Varnam, who did all the promotion for the records and wrote the advertising slogans for the shops. Virgin began to gain a broader reputation. With the best music playing in the shops and the warehouse all day, both the staff and the customers lying around smoking dope and talking about how to get hold of the highly prized American recording of Aerosol Grey Machine by Van der Graaf Generator, and everyone enjoying plenty of sex. There was no better place for any self-respecting 21-year-old to be. But beneath that there was a business to run. At the manor, building work dragged on. I dreaded every call from Tom Newman, who was fitting all the equipment. He always asked for more money to buy some other piece of recording equipment. At the same time, I had the customs fine, the mortgage, and the thought of prison hanging over me. The mail-order business was doing well, but mainly seemed to attract the serious music buyers, who were looking for quite rare records. It seemed difficult to expand it further. We realized that, if we were going to make money, it would have to come from opening up more Virgin Records shops. Nick and I began a program of serious expansion. Towards the end of 1971, and throughout 1972, we aimed to open a shop every month. By Christmas 1972, we had 14 record shops, several in London and one in every big city across the country. As well as organizing all the records that the shops would stock, advertising the shops, choosing and training the staff to run them, and setting up the accounting systems to keep control of the money, we found that the timing of shop openings was crucial. After negotiating the lease, until we were sure that the landlord would go no lower, we would push for a rent-free period for the first 3 months. This was the single most crucial element. We would not agree to open the shop unless this was in place, and as a result we walked away from a great many opportunities. However, when we opened, we knew that the record sales in the first 3 months would help pay for the rent on the previous shop that we had opened. The sales also demonstrated, without committing to a huge overhead, whether the site we had chosen attracted enough people off the streets to make the shop viable. As we opened these shops, we learned all sorts of lessons that stood us in good stead for the future. We always looked for the cheaper end of the high street, where we might attract shoppers to come a few extra yards off the beaten track, without us having to pay an exorbitant rent. We also chose areas where the teenagers hung out, such as near the Clock Tower in Brighton or Bold Street in Liverpool. We always asked the local teenagers where the best place for a record shop would be. There are many invisible lines in a town which people will not cross. A street can change character in the space of 20 yards. The other unique thing about record retailing is the speed with which records move. When a big release is out, like the latest David Bowie record, you can measure its sales in hours. You therefore need to keep right on top of the shop to find out what's selling that day. You can then use that information to rearrange the record displays in the other shops. If you run out of the key record that's selling that day, then of course, the buyer will head off to the next shop to pick it up. Once you've lost that chance to sell a copy of Hunky Dory, you never get it back again. There are no repeat sales of the same record. Although you will always stock Hunky Dory, up to 70% of your sales of it will happen in the first 2 weeks of its release. At first, Virgin promoted its image as a place where people could come and spend time listening to and choosing their records, with a distinct emphasis on elitist, hip taste. As well as the more mainstream records, we wanted to show teenagers more interesting ones. Our shops flatly refused to sell the mass-market teeny bopper records, such as the ones by the Osmonds and the Sweet, that were storming the charts. Despite Simon's persuasive arguments about style, our refusal to stock Gary Glitter and all the glam rock stars always slightly worried me, since I could see the short-term income we were turning away. However, Simon assured me that if we stuck to our image, we would keep our integrity and build up more customers. "It's the Andy Williams rule," he told me. "We're not in that market." The shop at 130 Notting Hill Gate became one of the best Virgin Records shops. Simon started working above it, and we laid our cushions on the floor in the shop so that people could lie around there all day. We knew that we were successful when people started coming up to London just to go to a Virgin Records shop. If we could have sold marijuana, we would have done. In fact, I suspect that some of the staff did. Selling records, chatting up the customers, recommending which music to buy, reaching under the counter for the latest bootleg, heading off to pubs and clubs to hear more bands play. It became a way of life. When we opened our Virgin Records shop in Bold Street, Liverpool, in March 1972, I proudly saw that we took £10,000 in the first week. A week later the figure was £7,000, and then the following week the takings were down to £3,000. By the middle of the summer they had dropped to £2,000, and I went up there to see what was going wrong. The shop was packed. There were rockers all jammed into one corner, mods in another, and hippies draped all over the floor near the till. All kinds of music were playing, but nobody was buying anything. Everyone was happily stoned and having a great time, but nobody could get to the till, and they were keeping other shoppers out of the store. The policy of treating our shops like clubs was out of control. For the next month we had someone at the door who gently warned people as they went in that they were going into a shop, not a nightclub. We put in brighter lights and moved the counter and the till nearer the window. It was a narrow line between maintaining the shop's atmosphere and keeping it profitable. The takings at last recovered. Throughout this expansion, one of our main difficulties was getting hold of the records to sell. Some record companies, including Polygram, refused to supply us because we were discounting and therefore offending the main retailers. Other record companies refused to supply us since they doubted our ability to pay. Nick and Chris Stylianow called around all the possible suppliers and eventually found an extraordinary solution: a record shop in South Woodford called Pop In, run by Raymond Laren. Raymond was prepared to use his account to buy records on our behalf. It was good business for him since he would order all our records on top of his own orders, charge a 5% margin, and pass them on to us. When we first struck this deal with Raymond, we would give him the list of records to add on to his orders. Tony or Simon would drive round and pick them up, and we'd drive them to the 3 or 4 Virgin shops. Poppin' was a tiny shop with matte black walls and peeling posters of Sgt. Pepper and Neil Young. It was difficult to squeeze in and out with the boxes of records, but we managed to cope. Over the next year, as we opened more and more shops, the number of records passing through Raymond's shop grew. Soon Raymond was ordering thousands of records from the record labels, and we were sending a lorry to collect them. We kept trying to deal with the record labels directly, but they continued to ignore us. Soon Virgin became one of the largest record chains in the country, and the scenes at Raymond's shop were farcical. A line of vans unloaded hundreds of cases of records at the front door, and people staggered through the shop to the back door, where they were loaded on to another line of vans to take them around the Virgin shops. Something had to give. We were still having to pay an extra 5% to buy our records through Raymond. Finally, Nick and I went back to the record labels and pointed out what was happening. They agreed to sell records to us directly, and Raymond Laren's Ealing comedy earner was over. His shop reverted to selling a few dozen records each week, and his accountants were left to puzzle over what had gone wrong with his amazing shop. During 1972, Simon fell in love with a South American girl and told me that he was going to leave Virgin and go to live in Chile with her. The Manor was at last open for artists to record. There were 20 Virgin Records shops, and the mail-order business was doing well. Simon had been working with me for a year, and, although neither of us had ever expected him to stay for more than a few months, I suddenly realized how vital he was to Virgin. His choice in music had established the Virgin Records shops as the place to go and buy records. It was hip to go and spend an afternoon mooching around the Virgin Records shop, whereas no self-respecting teenager would go and spend an afternoon hanging around Woolies. The credibility which Simon had always talked about, and the sales of the Osmonds which we had foregone, had worked. The music press now discussed which artists Virgin was promoting. When we put an eclectic German band called Tangerine Dream in our shop windows, it became a talking point. Record labels started contacting us and asking whether the Virgin Records shops could run special promotions on their bands. I tried to persuade Simon to stay, but he was set on leaving. His girlfriend went to Chile first, with Simon poised to join her in a month's time. During that month he suddenly received the Dear Simon letter from her, which called everything off. He was desperately disappointed, but at the same time it became clear that his future lay in London rather than either South America or even South Africa. Since Virgin now had the record shops and the recording studio, we started talking about the third part of the grandiose dream we had discussed over our first lunch at the Greek restaurant, the Virgin record label. If Virgin set up a record label, we could offer artists somewhere to record, we could publish and release their records. And we had a large and growing chain of shops where we could promote and sell their records. The three businesses were mutually compatible and would also benefit the bands we signed, since we could reduce prices at the manor, the manufacturing end, and increase promotion at the shops, the retail end, while still making our own profit. Simon and I drew up an agreement whereby he would set up and run the new Virgin record label, Virgin Music. He would own 20% of the company, which would henceforth be separate from the Virgin Records shops. And the first person Simon and I wanted to sign up was that third reserve guitarist from Hair, Mike Oldfield. Mike Oldfield had had a difficult childhood with an alcoholic mother. He had often locked himself up in his room in the attic and taught himself how to play all kinds of instruments. At the age of 14, he had made his first recording with his sister Sally, singing folk music. He and his sister formed a folk duo called Sally Angie and signed to Transatlantic Records. By 15 he had left home and become a guitarist alongside Dave Bedford with Kevin Ayers' group The Whole World. For a couple of weeks in October 1971, Mike was signed as a session guitarist to a singer called Arthur Lewis, who was recording at the Manor. Mike soon started chatting to Tom Newman, and one day finally screwed up the courage and gave him a tape of his own music. Mike had recorded this tape himself, laboriously overdubbing many different instruments onto the same tape. It lasted 18 minutes, was untitled and had no vocals. Tom listened to it and described it as hyper-romantic, sad, poignant and brilliant. Tom then played it to Simon when he was next up at the Manor. Simon was astonished by it. He tried to help Mike approach some record companies, but they all turned him down. A year later, Simon and I were sitting on the houseboat when we finally decided to start a record company. We called Mike up. To our delight, he had still not signed up with anyone. He felt completely rejected by the record industry and was overwhelmed that we seriously wanted to release his music. He came straight over to the houseboat to see us. I suggested that Mike should go back to the Manor and live there, and then whenever the recording studio was free he and Tom Newman could get together and work on his record. "I'll need to rent some instruments though," Mike warned me. "Like what?" I pulled out my diary and prepared a list. A good acoustic guitar, a Spanish guitar, a Farfisa organ, a Fender precision bass, a good Fender amplifier, glockenspiel, a mandolin, a mellotron. "What's that?" I drew a circle round it. "It's not absolutely necessary," Mike conceded. "A triangle, a Gibson guitar." "Oh, and some chimes, of course." "What are chimes?" I asked. "Tubular bells." I wrote down Tubular Bells and set about finding all these instruments in a music magazine. The guitar cost £35, the Spanish guitar £25, the Fender amplifier £45, the mandolin £15, and the triangle was a bargain at £1. The Tubular Bells cost £20. £20 for Tubular Bells? I said. They'd better be worth it.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.